Welcome back. In this lecture, we'll learn for loops. For loop is used to iterate a sequence, example a string, list, set, dictionary, tuple, and we'll cover the following topics. How to loop through a list using for loop through a string using for loop, use break statement to stop the execution of the loop before it reaches all the elements, use continue statement to stop the current iteration and continue with the next, and use range function to loop through the code by a specified number of times. Add parameter to specify the starting value of the index for range function. By default, the sequence gets incremented by 1. Use third parameter to specify the increment value. Use else in the for loop to execute a block of code when the for loop completes execution. Use nested loops to specify loop inside a loop. How to use pass statement when we have empty for loop. Now let's see the demo. Go to our IDE, PyCharm, practice new Python file, and let's name it for loop demo, and let's add the comment for loop demo. Now let's add the comments as well. So for loop is used to iterate a sequence. That sequence could be either a string, list, set, dictionary, tuple, etc. Now let's see how to loop through a list using for loop. Let's try to print the statement so we can see in the console, and let's try to create a list weekdays, and within the square brackets add the values Monday to Friday. And by using the for loop, let's try to iterate weekdays, and let's try to print the variable weekday. So control S to save the file and right click, run for loop demo. So now we can see we are able to iterate through the list weekdays and get the value using the for loop Monday to Friday. Similarly, now let's see how to loop through a string using for loop. Let me add this to the print function so we can see in the console, and let's take for lang in Python. So here we are trying to loop through the string Python and assign it to the variable lang, and let's try to print the variable lang. Now run it. So now you can see we were able to loop through the string Python and get the value Python. Now the next one, how to use break statement to stop the execution of the loop before it reaches all the elements. Now let's add it to the print function as well so we can see in the console, and let's try to take the same list and use the for loop. Let me take the same thing. If weekday equal to Wednesday, then break. So now let's try to run it. So once we reach Wednesday, then the execution will stop. Here we are trying to print weekday before we actually execute the break statement, so that's the reason we are seeing Wednesday printed in the console. Now let's try to take the same code and modify a little bit. Let's try to print this after the break statement. Now let's run it. So now we can see only Monday and Tuesday because we are printing the weekday variable at the end. So once it reaches Wednesday, this will not be printed anymore. The control comes out of the loop. So the next one, how to use continue statement to continue with the next iteration and skip the current one. So let's add that one to the print function, and let's take the same code, and instead of break, let's try to give continue. So it skips whenever the weekday is Wednesday and continue with the next iteration, that is Thursday and Friday. So let's run it. So now we can see Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday the execution is skipped, and then it continued with the next iteration Thursday and Friday. So that's how we can use break and continue. Break skips the execution completely. Continue skips the current iteration but can continue with the next iterations. Now let's see how to use range function to loop through the code by a specified number of times. So let me add it to the print function, and for weekdays in range 5, let's say, print, let's try to print the value inside weekdays. Now let's try to print this and see the value. So here notice the index started from 0, so we are trying to iterate from 0 to 4. So here we are using the range function to loop through the code by a specified number of times, that is 5 times, and the index starts from 0, so 0 to 4. So let's add that as well. Notice the index starts from 0. Now the next one is add parameter to specify the starting value of the index for range function. So let me add that as well to the print function, and for the same code, now let's try to give the starting parameter, let's say 2 to 2 comma 4. Now let's run it. So in this case, notice 4 is excluded, so we are saying 2 comma 3. The index 4 is excluded. So that's how we can specify the starting index for the range function and loop through the for loop. Now by default the sequence gets incremented by 1. Use the third parameter to specify the increment value. So let's add it to the print function, and let me take the same code, and instead of 2 comma 4, let's give 1 5 and specify the third parameter to increment the sequence. So now let's run it, and we can see 1, it is incremented by 2, so that is 3. 3 is incremented by 2, that is 5, but 5 is excluded, right? So that's the reason we are saying 1 comma 3. So by using the third parameter we can specify the sequence increment, otherwise it increments by 1. Now the next one is how to use else statement in for loop to execute a block of code when the for loop completes execution. So let's add it to the print function to see in the console. Now let's take for weekdays in range, let's say it is 0 to 4, right? So let's give 5 and print weekdays, else print not in the for loop. So now let's run it. So now we can see it printed from 0 to 4, and then the else statement executed, and we can see not in the for loop printed in the console. So that's how we can use the else statement in the for loop to execute a block of code when the for loop completes execution. Now the next one, how to use nested loops, that is loop inside a loop. So let's try to print this, and let's create a list, numbers list, and assign elements to it, 1 2 3 4 and 5. And let's create another list, alphabet list, and assign values x comma y comma z. So now let's loop for number in numbers list, print number, and for alphabet in alphabet list and print alphabet. So here this is the main for loop, and within the for loop we have one more for loop, so that is loop inside another loop. So notice we get error because we missed the indentation. So let's add it. So that is how we can create for loop inside another for loop, and we are looping through the numbers list and alphabet list. So now this is the inner loop, and it gets executed for each iteration of the outer loop. This is the inner loop, and it gets executed for each iteration of the outer loop. Now let's run it. So for 1 it prints x y z, and 2 again for each iteration of the outer loop, the inner loop gets executed x y z, and for 3 x y z, for 4 x y z, 5 x y z. So that's how we can write nested loops, that is loop inside another loop. The last one, how to use pass statement when we have empty for loop. Let's take the same numbers list, and let me copy them, same code, and let's assume we don't have any code within the for loop, and for specifying an empty for loop we can just give the statement pass, so that way we don't get any error. If we remove the pass and run it, so now we can see syntax error, unexpected end of file while parsing. So to specify a empty for loop, use pass statement. So in the next lecture we'll learn functions. All right, see you in the next lecture.